Ah, the common canister stove. Burns hot, convenient, easy to light, reasonably lightweight. Fuel's a little expensive, but it's not too bad. But boy do they suck in the wind. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have a windscreen for it like we commonly make for an alcohol stove? Well, that's what I've done here, and I'm going to run you guys through how to make this DIY windscreen for your canister stove. Okay, first things first, I want to talk about safety. If you're going to do any type of DIY windscreen for your canister stove, and the main thing you need to keep in mind is that you want to screen the wind away from the burner area up here, but you do not want your windscreen to completely go all the way down around your tank. And the reason is these fuel containers, the fuel will vaporize at most, temperatures that you're gonna find when you're backpacking. So if you warm this tank, it's going to drastically increase the pressure inside, and it could overpressurize it, in which case you could have a fire out of control or even maybe an explosion. So that's why we can't use an alcohol stove type windscreen, like a full windscreen that goes all the way down around. We need airflow around the tank to keep it cool. So any windscreen that we make has got to just block the wind up here at the burner area and leave the tank exposed out to the air so that it can keep cool. So make sure that if you do any type of adaptation of this that you're going to see in this video, that you heed that advice. Okay, one other thing I want to talk about before we get into the actual procedure for making this windscreen is that this particular one that I came up with will only work with certain stoves and pots. Obviously, the way this works, if I take the pot out of the way, is the windscreen is resting on the tips of the pot supports. So you need to be using a pot, therefore, that is smaller than your pot supports when they're fully deployed, and by a little bit of a margin so that you have room for your pot to sit on there and exhaust to come around the edges here. So like if I was using a larger pot that fully covered the pot support completely, obviously this wouldn't work. And I can't just set a pot on top of this because then there's nowhere for the exhaust to go. So it's kind of specialized in that regard, that it will only work with a stove that has extending pot supports beyond the diameter of your pot, like I have here. This is a 700 milliliter Stoic titanium pot. This is the Covea Super Light Stove, which is very similar to the Snow Peak Light Max. So just keep that in mind. This will be a little bit restrictive. It may not work for every type of canister stove out there, but hopefully the idea, you can find something that'll adapt to your exact stove. So what we're gonna need to make our final windscreen that you can see here is actually just an empty fuel container. This is a 220 gram size fuel container. You can use any of the brands that are out there. They're basically the identical dimensions. But that's the only thing we're gonna need as far as the input material. Everything else will just be tools and whatnot. So to start off, you'll need an empty fuel container. Okay, so the first thing you're gonna do if you're using a canister is you need to make sure that it's completely empty of fuel. So what I've done with this one is I've burned it completely out until it won't take a flame anymore. And then I've left it fully throttled open. There I'm closing it, but I've left it open outside in a well-ventilated area for, this one's actually been sitting for a couple days. And then after about the first day, another thing I did is I punched a little hole in the bottom with like a nail. And again, let that sit for a couple days. The fuel inside is pretty volatile, so it'll find its way out of there. But just, be safe. Make sure there's no fuel left before you start cutting into it. You really don't want to screw that one up. Okay, next up, we want to mark where we're going to do our cuts to cut the bottom and the top off. And I usually just find like decks of cards or pieces of wood, rolls of tape, anything that just lying around that gets it pretty close. In this case, if I set the canister up on top of this framing square and I just hold my marker like so. See, I'm cutting right above this little rim around the bottom. Similarly, I found that if I use this roll of masking tape up top, I'll cut it right below this curve there. So I'll go around and mark the lines all the way around. Okay, so next we got to do those cuts that we've marked. I've rigged up a Dremel here next to my table saw's rip fence using some clamps and some scratch wood. I don't think you need a Dremel to do this. You don't need to rig up something like this. You can cut it by hand. You could obviously cut it with like a hacksaw. I think if you cut up higher, like away from your finished cut, you could even then go around with a pair of scissors to trim it up. Either way, since I have the tools, this is how I've got it set up. I'm gonna go ahead and get started here, but the noise is gonna be pretty obnoxious, so I'm just gonna do a little test cut and then I'll finish the rest of it off camera. Okay, hopefully the noise wasn't too bad, but here you can see it's cutting right in the middle of our line. So we'll go around that, get it set to do the bottom one, which I'll probably turn it upside down and just do the same technique since I've got a nice flat surface here on the table saw. And I'll come back once we have the cuts done. Just to show you guys the full setup I was using there, that's how I rigged up my Dremel. You can see just a couple clamps holding it up there on the rip fence on the table saw. I finished cutting the top off. I gotta reset it to cut the bottom, but just showing you that. Nice round all the way. It's still pretty burry, but we'll clean that up in a little bit. Okay, the cuts are all done. Here's the top of the canister cut off and the bottom cut off. And here's the piece we're interested in. Now it's gonna be pretty burry. I went ahead and off camera, I sanded it down a little bit, filed it up, and used a old pocket knife to clean all the burrs out so it's not sharp. Definitely want to do that because it'll be really sharp and nasty. And then the next thing we'll do is take your stove and put it on a new canister and get all the legs deployed and make sure that they're all the way around on a stove like this where they fold to all to one side. You want to make sure that they're spread out all the way and in their maximum position. And then you're going to want to take your ring and set it up here. What we're going to do next is mark where the legs are gonna protrude through. Now, if you happen to own a Snow Peak Light Max, or my stove here is actually not a Light Max, it's a Covea Super Light. If you set the ring on the second tooth on each of the supports, it'll be perfectly centered. But you wanna get it as perfectly centered as possible. And then you're gonna just go around and somewhere nearby, just mark a little dot like that all the way around where each of the legs are. Okay, so there you can see how it's sitting on the leg supports. You can see I've gone around and marked a dot like that at each of the legs. And then also I've made one notch in between two of the legs. And as far as picking which one to do, in the case of the Superlight, this is the rigid leg. So when it folds up, all the legs fold to this one. So I find that it works best to mark the place you're gonna cut a vertical notch in between your rigid leg and the next leg over. And that way, once the ring is cut, it's gonna have some spring that tries to open it and it'll keep your legs open. If you cut it somewhere else, it can try to collapse one or two of your legs. You'll see how that works later. Okay, now that we've got the little notches marked around the circumference, we need to figure out how high up and down they need to go so that the windscreen blocks the wind from the burner most efficiently. And what I've found is if you're looking at your stove straight on like this, obviously here's where the flame is. We need this area between here and the pot to be blocked the most. So we're gonna want our windscreen, when it's on there, to basically be centered on or a little bit above where the burner is, since obviously the flame is gonna go up. And you want it to be above the pot supports too, so that the wind doesn't blow across and interfere with the flame that way. So just by eyeballing it here, it looks like about maybe 1/4 of an inch down from that top is where I'd want the top of the notch to be. So 1/4 of an inch down. And I'm just doing that by eyeball and past experience, but you do whatever you think will work best for your stove. Okay, so now we're gonna mark exactly where the top of that notch is gonna sit. This is the bottom edge of my, I mean, it doesn't matter, but I'm gonna have it so that the text is right side up. So I'm just gonna hold a ruler here in line. This little mark here is where I marked where the pot support's gonna be. So I'm gonna square up with that, and then 1/4 inch from the top is there. So the top of this line is gonna be the top of my notch. And then as far as how deep the notch is gonna be, you can do that based on your own stove. But obviously this is gonna sit down like this. So I can cut it deeper so that it's easier to put in, but the top there is where it's actually gonna be resting. Okay, we finished all the longitudinal markings now. Here's 1, 2, and 3 for the notches, and then I also marked the full line from where for where I want it to cut longitudinally, and just marked that squared up all the way along the length. So now we'll use the Dremel or whatever tools you're using again to cut all these out. Okay, the only thing left is I haven't made my longitudinal cut here, but I've got the notches all cut out, and I'm just doing kind of a test fit to make sure it looks good and looks nice and centered on there, which it does. So now the last thing will just be to cut this strip here. And the reason we had to cut that is for storage reasons that I'll show you in a little bit later. As nice as it is like this to keep it whole, it just makes it very difficult to store without it being damaged. So we'll show you how that works soon. Okay, so I finished that longitudinal cut and kind of clipped these corners off. I'll sand them up so they're a little round to get rid of all the burrs and stuff. As you can see though, just because of the memory in that piece of steel, it's a little wonky right now. So I'm gonna take it and roll this over like this canister here or something to get it so that when it's just resting on its own, it kind of holds the shape we want. Okay, then the last thing I'm doing here, I've got it fitted on there, and I'm using a piece of wire to kind of hold the shape that I want. I rolled it around on like some metal cans and got it pretty close, but it wasn't quite where I wanted it. I figured having the heat hit it would kind of help set the shape that I wanted. As you can see here, I've got the stove going total full tilt, just burning off the inner liner and the paint and stuff on the outside. Definitely do this in a well-ventilated area. It's a little windy outside, so I have the door shut just for the moment so I can talk and don't have to fight over it, but I'm gonna go ahead and let it keep burning until it looks to be pretty well done, and open up the door and get it venting. Okay, just putting the final touches on. I got all the paint except around the bottom, as you can see there when it was set up on the stove, so I've pulled it off. I have the windscreen wrapped up with some tie wire, and I'm just gonna turn the stove up here, get it lit, and get the rest of this paint burned off. Once again, I recommend doing this in a well-ventilated area. We'll just go around the whole windscreen, use some leather gloves so that we don't burn ourselves, and I'll be back once I get the rest of this paint removed. Mainly just removing the paint now so that it doesn't come off when I'm out backpacking at some point, you know. Just get rid of it now, and then you never have to worry about it. All right, well that's basically it. We're all done, and as you can see, it stores around the outside of our fuel canister with just a couple rubber bands to hold it in place. That's why we unfortunately had to slice it right there, because if you keep it its normal size, it won't slide on top of another fuel canister. So that is a nice space-saving option there. For those of you who don't want to use a canister, you can mess around with some other containers. I actually got extremely lucky and found this this container. This is a Scotch whiskey canister, and it actually fits just like it was made for it going around there. So then that makes it a little bit easier because it's not flimsy. You know, it it uses minimal weight and it stays as one nice solid round ring. I tried making one out of that same container as this one, but it just didn't quite turn out right. I think it has to do with the fact that there's a seam here where it's rolled around, whereas the fuel containers are all one single wall. But if anybody's curious, this was years ago. I don't know if they still make the same container, but it's Bruichladdich Rocks Scotch whiskey. That's where that container came from. So that's the one I use. But I didn't want to make a video about that since it's such a specialized container. Obviously, anybody who uses a canister stove has empty canisters around, and you can make a little windscreen for yourself that packs up real nice and works real well. You saw it running at the beginning of this video, so I hope that was helpful. If anybody has any questions, let me know. Cheers, and thanks for watching.